it's a very timely situation from a biblical standpoint with what is going on. Jerusalem was reestablished as their capital in 2018, May 14th, 2018, 70 years to the day after the state of Israel was established. And so on May 14th, 2018, it was recognized as that. I believe that's the fulfillment of the prophecy in Luke 21, that the Gentiles will trod down Jerusalem until the times of the Gentiles are completed, are fulfilled. And I believe that is the advent into the last days. Okay, now I could be wrong. That's speculation. We'll only know after the fact. But this is a time to lift up your eyes, knowing that our redemption draws near. What we see happening in the world is clearly way beyond anything that we've seen the rest of our lives. God is at work. Israel is in the center of what is going on. I believe we're going to see the greatest awakening in the history of the world. I also think we're going to see the greatest abandonment of faith in the history of the world, in cataclysmic spiritual forces battling one another. And it will become more and more obvious as the days go forward. And so this section of First Timothy we're going to be looking at is particularly timely because it talks about the need to pray. Okay, so we're going to take a look at that right now. First Timothy, and we'll start at the end of chapter 1. Paul says to Timothy, Timothy, my son, I am giving you this command in keeping with the prophecies once made about you, so that by recalling them, you may fight the battle well. Okay, Paul is describing the Christian walk as a battle. And for someone in a position of leadership, in this case, Timothy, who is in Ephesus, who has the responsibility of straightening out a church that is starting to go wrong. And when I say church, I don't mean a church with a building and a nice spire and a cross on the top. It's the people who are there, the family of God. One of the words translated church is Koryakous, which means the family of the Lord. Okay, and so there are problems with the family in Ephesus, and Timothy is given the responsibility by Paul to straighten things out, and he's given instructions on how to do that. And those instructions go beyond just straightening out the family, but also how do you protect it going forward? And then what are they supposed to do? How do they live their lives? And so he says, fight the battle well, holding on to faith and a good conscience. In other words, there are casualties in this battle, people who lose their faith. Now, some would contest that, but read what it says here, and you'll see what he's talking about, that it is a battle to stay faithful in a world that is so antagonistic to the gospel. And in Ephesus, clearly they were encountering that. It was the place for the temple of Artemis, the temple of Diana. That was the big attraction. It was a tourist attraction. People came there to see the temple, the way that people come to Orlando to see Disney World and the other attractions. I mean, this was a big thing. It was the center. And it was not at all pro-Christian. And there were a lot of people who were antagonistic to Christians in Ephesus. And some of them had converted apparently to Christianity and then abandoned it. In fact, they abandoned it though in a unique way. They stayed within the church and tried to sell other people on distortions of the gospel. So he says to Timothy, hold on to faith and a good conscience, which some have rejected and so have suffered shipwreck with regard to their faith, meaning they started out, everything seemed fine, and they bought into a lot of crazy things, some coming from their past. Elsewhere, earlier, he called them myths, and they were trying to sell these myths and strange ideas. And he says, among them are Hymenaeus and Alexander. Alexander was a metal worker. He was a guy who made the little uh, copper and perhaps silver copies of the temple of Artemis to sell to people. It was a good business. Okay, and that was the business he gave up to follow the Lord. And who knows what he was doing at this point, but he was pretty much steeped in the whole temple worship thing. Okay, and then Paul says, whom I've handed over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme. Um, he's basically just said, you're out of the church. Okay, you want Satan's realm, you're in his realm. Go and do whatever you want to do, but not in the church. Now, insofar as all the implications of being handed over to Satan, we'll address that when we get to chapter 3, when it talks about the trap of Satan and who winds up being at risk of falling into the trap of Satan. Okay, he talks about that with regards to overseers. The greatest area of risk is for those who have two different ways of living. One way is within the church family, amongst other believers, but then they are bicultural, and they're steeped in the culture that's antagonistic to the church, the antagonistic culture, antagonistic to Christ. So anyway, we'll look at that in chapter 3. For today, though, what is the command? Here it is. I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people. Okay? Number 1, first order, the sine qua non, without which nothing. Pray. That's it. Pray. Now, it's hard to pray. Prayer is not easy. Okay? It's not easy for a number of factors. I don't know what you've encountered, but I have found that when you really start to pray, there's interruptions that happen. There are other things to do. There are critical things that seem to be far more important than praying right at this moment. It's a battle to pray, but that is the critical means by which we fight this battle offensively, to pray. And what that's really saying is we don't fight it offensively. We call upon God to fight the battle for us. And he says, pray. And here's the first foundational thing to pray for: kings and all those in authority. You mean I'm going to pray for somebody who is in a party that I disagree with? Pray for somebody who maybe's done horrendous things, positions of leadership? Well, we are seeing in our day how critical it is who runs things in a country. And we've seen entire countries change in their value system based on who is running the country at any given time. And so you can say, well, it's just a matter of who you elect. Well, ultimately, God puts in place whoever he chooses. If we take a look back at Daniel chapter 4. Okay, this starts out speaking about King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar was actually a pretty bad guy prior to chapter 4. He did a lot of bad things. He was the individual more than anyone else who established Babylonia or Babylon as a world power, and it was, in many regards, the first great world power. But certainly, insofar as the biblical record is concerned, this was the great world power of that time. They took Israel captive, all of Israel. And Nebuchadnezzar was pretty tough on anyone he captured. It was a ruthless time. And King Nebuchadnezzar writes this. Chapter 4 is not written by Daniel. It's written by Nebuchadnezzar. And in it, he relates a dream. And he begins by saying something very interesting. So he's writing this to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth. So this is a proclamation that is evangelistic. This is Nebuchadnezzar, bad dude who has this transformation. And he says, "It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most God High has performed for me." Okay, can you imagine? Now, think of anyone anywhere in the world who runs any country issuing a proclamation like this. Okay, this was unique and perhaps unique for all time. Nebuchadnezzar was prideful, and he believed that he had accomplished this great, great thing of conquering so many cultures and building such a great kingdom and building a city that was one of the wonders of the world. And now here he points to God. And what he's going to tell in chapter 4 is how it was that he came to this conclusion that God is above everything. He says, how great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. And then he tells the story that he's home in his palace, he's lying in bed, and he has these images and visions passing through my mind, and they terrified him. So then many of you recall the story, how he then asked all of his astrologers, his enchanters, his magicians, diviners to come in and explain this dream to me. But he said, I'm not going to tell you my dream. You have to tell me my dream and then interpret it. He understood that he was dealing with some of them who were charlatans. And he wanted to make sure that he was really finding out what this dream meant. And then finally, Daniel comes in and hears the dream. And Daniel then explains to him exactly what the dream means. And it's a scary dream because in that dream, he has a vision. And the vision, he says, I looked, there before me was a holy one, an angel, a messenger. The word for angel, angelos, in Greek means messenger, a messenger coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree, trim off all its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, the birds from its branches, but let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground and the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. And it says this is going to happen. And this is a prophecy then about what's going to happen to Nebuchadnezzar, where he's going to lose his whole kingdom. He's going to go crazy. For 7 years, he's going to live like an animal. And then his mind will be restored, and his kingdom will be restored. And in verse 17, we read, the decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict so that, okay, and you see it here in yellow, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of people. Okay, catch that? Sets over them the lowliest of people. Now, this phrase will be repeated multiple times here in chapter 4. And it is that God puts in place over the kingdoms of the earth anyone he wishes. And typically, he chooses, those who are amongst the lowliest of people. Now, there obviously have been exceptions to that. Daniel interprets the dream, and he tells him 7 times or 7 years will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. So this is all happening so that Nebuchadnezzar will recognize that he is not the one in charge, that he did not do this, but God did this through him and for the peoples of the earth. Okay, and then what was prophesied, all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later. He's walking on the roof. He's admiring the incredible kingdom that he has built. And he said, is not this the great Babylon I've built as a residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? And then a voice comes from heaven. Okay, imagine that. He's standing there proclaiming how wonderful it is what he's done. And he hears a voice from heaven thundering. This is what I decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people, will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until 7 years will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Okay, and so you can see again and again and again, the emphasis is for the leader of the country to acknowledge that he is not the utmost authority. God is. And God put him in place, and God can obviously replace him. And that's what he shows Nebuchadnezzar. And he, at the end of that time, at the end of the 7 years, he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. So when he turned to God, his sanity was restored. And then it says, I praised the Most High, I honored and glorified him who lives forever. And then a little psalm, a little song. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? And then he says, as my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and my nobles sought me out. I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. And then notice this. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Okay, so what you can get from this is that the leaders we have are the leaders God has put in place. And if we want better leaders, we need to pray to God. Prayer is the power that moves the hand of God. When Paul writes to Timothy, he's saying, first of all, pray for kings, for those who are in authority. Now, an interesting thing about Daniel chapter 4, the rest of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. Daniel chapter 4, which is a proclamation by Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, King Nebuchadnezzar, this is a proclamation he makes to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth. Instead of this being in Hebrew, which was really just a language of the Jews that really was almost going away, when the Jews were taken into captivity in Babylon, they abandoned Hebrew and largely spoke Aramaic. Aramaic was the language that was the main language throughout the Middle East, throughout much of the earth at that time. This is written in Aramaic because he's writing this to the nations. This is not to the Jews. This is to everyone. And we have this now today, here in the book of Daniel. It's interesting, in the book of Daniel, we read about Daniel, we find out he's a man of prayer. Daniel chapter 9, chapter 10. When Gabriel appears to Daniel, he says, Daniel, as soon as you began to pray, I was dispatched. In other words, Gabriel may have just been sitting there, just waiting and waiting. When's he going to pray? When is Daniel going to pray? Well, Daniel prays, and he says, hey, it's the 70th year. Since the captivity, Jeremiah prophesied that we would only be here 70 years and then the captivity would end. Just want to remind you, Lord. Well, he didn't quite pray that way. He prayed, oh, Lord, you are great and everything you do is right. And then he comes and he asks about the end of the captivity. And Gabriel then comes and tells him, not only am I going to tell you about the end of the captivity, I'm going to tell you everything that's going to happen after this. Okay, so what we see here in the book of Daniel is that kings, those in positions of responsibility, What we must hope for them and pray for is that they would honor God above themselves. Look, we're in America. It's our leaders may or may not be believers. They don't have to be, theologically perfect. But there's just one thing. You remember that movie, City Slickers? One thing. The one thing is to acknowledge there is a God above them and to seek, however they can, to honor him. Doesn't mean they're believers. It means, though, that they acknowledge that they're not the final answer. They're not in ultimate control. So we're supposed to pray for kings and all those in authority. And over the years, there have been people who have come to the Lord. And we saw with Nebuchadnezzar the incredible transformation in his life in power, and then taken out of power by God, and then restored once again. Now, we're also supposed to pray that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. Notice it is not, we're going to make the country, at this point it's Rome, that we're going to make the empire Christian, run by Christians. Rather, it is that a Christian, a follower of Christ, might have the ability to live a peaceful life, a quiet life, in godliness and holiness. Okay, so we may not change the world. Now, in recent times, there's been the claim that you have so many people who are Christians who have put the country ahead of Jesus Christ. And a lot of that is political positioning. There's no question that Christians have migrated to one party. One party is opposed to abortion. One party seeks to promote God and still has God in its platform. The other does not. And you begin going point by point, and you see that one party chooses to honor God, another party says, no, we've gotten God out of here 20 years ago. So the thing is, persecution. I mean, in Iran, we should be praying that the leadership changes in Iran. And they can change one of two ways. Ayatollah Khomeini could become a follower of Christ. Now you say, that could be. How could that be? Hey, Paul was a persecutor of Christians. He became a follower of Christ, a promoter of Christ, and sought to undo as much as he could the bad things, the evil things he had done when he was not a believer. You don't know where prayer will lead. But the one thing we do know is if we don't pray, you know what happens. Nothing. So we have to pray. And that's what he's saying to Timothy. First command, first, foremost, above anything else, pray. And he says, this is good. Praying and pleases God our Savior, who wants all people to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. Okay, isn't that interesting? God's desire is that all be saved. Now, all will not be saved. And then he says to Timothy, look, there's one God, one mediator between God and mankind, between God and man, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all people. Now, Jesus spoke about himself as being a ransom for many. Okay, and how do you get those two to fit together? Well, in reality, what it is this. The ransom is sufficient for all, but efficient or effective only for the elect. In other words, it's there for the taking, but not everybody will take it. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone, that's pretty all-inclusive. If anyone opens the door, I will come in and sup with him. He will establish a relationship. God desires that. He does not desire that any should perish. However, not all will. For some, they won't hear. For others, they will hear and reject. For some, they'll hear, as Jesus talks about in the parable of the sower, and initially say, "Hey, this is great," and then as soon as the hard times come, they'll abandon that. So he emphasizes this. He's talking to Timothy, and when he talks about praying for kings and all those authority, he wants them to come to the Lord. That's what he wants. But the absolute minimum is to acknowledge that God is the authority over everything. And so we need to pray about that. And then Paul continues on, this has now been witnessed to at the proper time. And for this purpose, I was appointed a herald and apostle. I'm telling the truth. I'm not lying, and a true and faithful teacher of the Gentiles. In other words, there's one mediator between God and man. We now know that. He says it's been witnessed to at the proper time. And he says, that's the reason. There's only one way. That's the reason I've been appointed as an apostle, to go to the Gentiles. Therefore, he says, I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. All right, now, this matter of prayer. It's easy to think prayer, you're just praying into the air. In fact, you've heard perhaps in the public square on the news and from some politicians at times saying, you're in our thoughts and prayers, when somebody goes through a hard time. Well, we're praying for you. That, in fact, that was kind of like saying, well, I can't do anything, so I'm going to pray. Picture the surgeon coming out of the operating room, and he says, well, there's nothing more we can do except to pray. Okay, as if there's really nothing to do. And as if prayer doesn't really have that much power. It's kind of a Hail Mary thrown up there, and well, maybe. You know what? The power of prayer is so underestimated. Let me show you something most interesting. All right, let's take a look at, now I'm going to go to Wikipedia, and I'm going to show you an interesting section, and you can look this up for yourself. It's actually well written and positive towards Christians. George Mueller is an interesting guy. Okay, so this is in the 1800s, early part of the 1800s. He was a pastor. He was an evangelist. And he did something that was incredible. He, without ever asking anyone for a penny and without any government support, only accepting unsolicited gifts, he raised in his lifetime almost 4 million English pounds sterling at that point, which is about 113 million in today's terms. Okay, what did he do with that? Well, you can see he used the money to distribute 285,407 Bibles, almost 1.5 million New Testaments, 250,000 other texts translated into 20 other languages. And then it says the money was also used to support faith missionaries around the world, such as Hudson Taylor. And that work that he started continues to this day. Okay, now, the biggest thing he did was he started orphanages. He had over 10,000 orphans that he took care of. And these orphanages, it got to a point where he just didn't have enough room to care for them, and he needed to build buildings. And here it says by 26 May 1870, 1,722 children were being accommodated in 5 homes. And then ultimately, he had built room for over 2,000, and that would expand, and he would wind up building more. But here's the important thing. Through all this, he never made requests for financial support. He never went into debt. And even though those 5 homes cost more than 100,000 pounds to build at that time, so massive sums of money in today's world, he would receive unsolicited food donations only hours before they were needed to feed the children. Mueller was in constant prayer. Okay, and so that's the thing. A man of prayer. If you've never read an autobiography of George Mueller, pick one up. It is the most encouraging thing to see the prayers that were answered. And as he prayed, He was praying that God would touch the hearts of the donors. He never asked them. He prayed when he had a need. And so here it talks about one well-documented occasion. They gave thanks for breakfast when all the children were sitting at the table, but there was nothing to eat in the entire house. And so as they finished praying, the baker knocked on the door with enough fresh bread to feed everybody. And the milkman gave them plenty of fresh milk because his cart had just broken down in front of the orphanage. Okay, and so here's something that he wrote in his autobiography, February 12th, 1842. A brother in the Lord came to me this morning and after a few minutes of conversation gave me 2,000 pounds for furnishing the new orphan house. Now I'm able to meet all of the expenses. In all probability, I'll even have several £100 more than I need. The Lord not only gives as much as is absolutely necessary for his work, but he gives abundantly. This blessing filled me with inexplicable delight. He had given me the full answer to my thousands of prayers during the past 1,195 days. So he never sought donations from any individual. Rather, he prayed. Now, you might say, well, okay, George Mueller, 1800s, that's a long time ago and hard to relate to. You know, when I lived up in New Jersey, we had a family in our area, and there are a few folks on from the New Jersey area who may remember the family. It was the Sheptock family. Now, Joanne and Rudy Sheptock had 30 kids. 5 of them, I think, were theirs, and the other 25 were orphans. And the orphans that they adopted were kids. One kid had no arms. It's a thalidomide baby. Many of them had various handicaps of all types. There were discipline problems. There were any number of other things. And Ingrid and I on occasion would stop by at the Sheptocks, and it was the most spiritually encouraging place you could go because you constantly had stories that were told of God's provision in the most amazing ways. Not just his provision, but other things as well. First of all, the way they got the house. They were living in a smaller house. The house was in Peapack Gladstone, small village area there in north central New Jersey. And Joanne had driven past this house. It was a good sized house because they needed more room to house all these kids they were getting. And as she drove past, she would pray about it. And then she had a picture of the house that she put on her refrigerator. And she was praying about it constantly, about that house. Now, the house wasn't even for sale when she started praying about it. Well, then the house went up for sale. And she prayed about getting the house. And she went to a realtor, and a realtor showed her the house. And then the realtor asked her about their finances to be able to afford the house. It was not going to be a cheap house. Had a lot of land, and it was a big house. It was, Joanne had no money. She had been supporting the kids with her husband on her husband's salary, and he was a janitor at the high school. And they didn't have huge savings. God had just provided what they needed when they needed it to support these kids. They never asked anyone. The realtor kind of felt a little taken advantage of, but Joanne went to the bank to see about getting a mortgage. And the banker effectively laughed initially, but as they talked, ultimately, the bank decided to give them a mortgage. And they were able to buy the house. There's more to the story than that. A lot more miracles happened for them to get the house, but they get the house. And then it was an old house. There were things that were needed to be done. They started having problems with the electricity. They prayed about it. Shortly after they began praying, an electrician stopped by and knocked on the front door just to say, I was in the area and I thought you might need my help. and he charged them nothing. People would drop by and just drop off food, drop off toys, drop off any number of different things. And it was just what they needed at that time. In fact, they had an overflow. So I was pastoring at the time. I remember one time we stopped by to see Joanne. She told us more of the stories, these incredible things that just kept happening to them as they prayed. They had too much food, so they gave us 2 bags full of food to take home with us because they didn't want it to go bad. Okay, now you can say, oh, how can people live a life like that? That can't possibly be something that could happen to me. Well, why not? Same God. It wasn't Joanne. It wasn't Rudy. They raised those kids. And boy, I'll tell you what, the testimony of those children's lives, unbelievable. I mean, and you want to raise kids who love the Lord? Let them see the power of God. You want to raise grandkids who love the Lord? Let them see how God answers prayer. You know, we were fortunate. There were a few times in our lives where we just saw massive answers to prayer. Some of them I've shared with you before. But it's been little things as well as big things. Because if God can't handle the little stuff, why do you think he can handle the big stuff? You know, many people don't pray because they think, oh, God's too busy to answer my little prayer. Well, we were headed off to seminary. We had just sold our house. We didn't have very much money at that point. We were going to use the equity in the house to pay for seminary, and so that I could, during the first year, not work, and would just use the equity to live on, and then whatever else God chose to provide. And the day before we were set to move out, we walked into the kitchen, and Ingrid said, the refrigerator is not making any noise. Well, in those days, refrigerators hummed. They made a little noise. Modern ones are a little quieter. And I opened the door, and sure enough, it was getting warm. It wasn't working. And we really, it was going to be a challenge to have to go out and buy a refrigerator right then. So I went into the basement, got my box of tools, and came up to see if I could fix the refrigerator. I didn't know how to fix the refrigerator, but I figured better than just sitting there watching it. Before I even laid a hand on the refrigerator, Ingrid said to me, well, let's pray about it. And, you know, a little part of me said, praying about a refrigerator, that I'd never heard of that before. And so I stood there with her and we prayed that the refrigerator would resume working. Okay, we finished our prayer. I opened the toolbox. I walked over to open the door of the refrigerator, and my hands were a few inches away, and it started to hum. And it worked fine for years after that. God answers even tiny little prayers. And I viewed that as just him presenting an object lesson to us, that as we were headed into the unknown of seminary, that he would provide. And he did all the way through. And we had answers to prayer that were incredible. Everything worked out phenomenally. It was a wonderful, wonderful time in our lives. But we saw it in other areas as well. I saw it in business. I saw it with family. We've seen it with Ingrid's battle with cancer. We saw it with our children. God answers prayer. And that's the emphasis that Paul gives Timothy. First thing, here you go. You're going into this church. You're going into this group of people. You're a young man. You have one primary objective: get them to pray. Get them to pray. Now, when it comes to countries, prayer is pretty substantial too. You know, in England, Wilberforce was a majority of one in the parliament. He was the only guy who was there saying we got to get rid of slavery. He was a young man. Now, as he got older, he continued to promote the idea that we need to abolish slavery. And over time, the entire parliament agreed with him. And he was on his deathbed. as England abolished slavery. 600,000 people were not dying out in the field, shooting one another, as happened here in our Civil War. One man praying. There were others who were praying with him, certainly. Certainly John Newton, who was his mentor, the man who wrote Amazing Grace, he certainly was praying, and there were so many others as well. Prayer is the power that moves the hand of God. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking on the 25th. We're going to have a men's gathering at noontime, and maybe Larry will mention just a little bit about that at the end today. But the whole goal is going to be to get men to pray and establish prayer groups, praying for our nation, praying that we would see a great moving of the Holy Spirit. Now, the idea is not new. In 1857, you had a man who, not a great speaker, had no great position of authority or power. He was in New York City, and he was just working at the Dutch Reformed Church there to help organize something. And the something was just a little prayer group praying for revival. And so his name was Jeremiah Lanphier. I've also seen it as William Lanphier, but I'm pretty sure it's Jeremiah Lanphier. His name was Jeremiah Lanphier. He put little cards in the windows of a couple of stores, and he handed out flyers that said, praying for revival, noontime. And he put the place, I think it was the old Dutch Reformed Church on Fulton Street in New York City. And he was there at noon, and the first day, waiting for the people to come to pray. And after 5 minutes, nobody came. After 10 minutes, nobody came. After 20 minutes, nobody came. About a half an hour in, one person wandered in. They began praying. It's a very small group first day. It started with a very small group. And then they had more the next prayer meeting, a few more, and then a few more after that. And then October of 1857, there was a crash on Wall Street. A lot more came. It wasn't long before they had to rent out a movie theater because so many people were praying for revival. And then they had to rent out other buildings. And then there were offices that opened their doors for prayer. And then people traveling to other cities would start prayer groups praying for revival in other cities. And then in early 1858, there was a man who was traveling back to Chicago from the West who reported that at every stop of the train, he found a prayer group praying for revival. Well, later in 1858, the revival happened. The population of the United States at that point was approximately 20 million people. You can examine church rolls, historical church rolls, to see that 2 million people came to Christ during that revival. Okay, can you imagine? It transformed the nation, and it continued on. There were revivals in the Confederate Army. There were revivals in the Union Army after the war had started. There was a change in America. And when you look at what America was like in the early 1850s, okay, it was completely transformed by the time you got later into the 1860s. We need to pray. We need to pray. We need to be praying for our families. We need to be praying for our country. We need to be praying for our president and for everyone in authority, local, national, international. We need to be praying.